This is episode 95 of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast, and I'm your host, John S. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Bruce H. from the Many Paths Group in Seattle, Washington. Bruce has been sober for over 40 years and recently was a keynote speaker at the Widening the Gateway conference in Tacoma. In this episode, we'll talk about what it was like when he was getting sober in the 1970s and the changes he's seen in AA since that time. We'll also discuss his journey through sobriety, what he's learned, how he approaches the program, and how he has always made a home for himself in Alcoholics Anonymous. How you doing, Bruce?
I'm doing great.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me and the listeners of our podcast.
I'm thrilled and flattered to be a part of it, so thank you for asking.
Well, I really enjoyed your talk in Tacoma, and reading through the transcript, there were a lot of things that came up that I wanted to kind of get into a little bit more detail. And just to go right from the beginning, if you don't mind, there was when you started your talk, you were introducing yourself, and we always customarily introduce ourselves as I'm John and I'm an alcoholic. And you did something a little bit different. And then you wanted to talk about identity. This has actually come up in our meetings here locally too, the question of identity. So can you go into maybe a little bit more detail about what you've been thinking about lately when it comes to identity?
Well, I've been thinking about it because it's become for me like saying I'm Bruce, I'm an alcoholic is like a rote thing. It's like I say it without thinking about it even. And it strikes me as a pretty one-dimensional thing. I did a lot of drugs too. So I identify equally as much as an addict, as an alcoholic, but it really was in AA that I found fellowship and I found a home. I got sober in Minneapolis in 1975. I was 20 years old and I was in a treatment center. And one of the buzzwords or not buzzwords, but identity words that was controversial then was coming out of the treatment centers. Often people would refer to themselves, I would say I'm Bruce and I'm chemically dependent. And that was okay in some meetings. And then there were other meetings where they said, no, that's not okay. If you don't say you're an alcoholic, you can't be here, almost that literally. And it's interesting. About 6 months ago, I met a woman here in Seattle who got sober in Minneapolis in the early 80s. And she did not go through a treatment center. She got sober in AA. And she was talking about how she and her sponsor would go to these meetings that were mostly men, and they were very, by the book, shall we say, very, fundamentalist. And it reminded me of how there really were these two cultures in AA in Minneapolis back then. Minneapolis was a leader in the treatment center place, Hazelden in particular. I did not go through Hazelden. I went through a similar program at a place called St. Mary's Hospital that's, I don't think, any long. It's got some other name now. But there was that real tension between people coming out of the treatment centers and people in traditional AA. And I actually think, for me, I was very fortunate to have landed in that environment, in that place, because if I had just landed in what we call traditional AA, I don't think I would have stuck around. I found within the meetings that I went to, first of all, there were lots of young people getting sober and staying sober at that time. And it was really, from the first meeting I went to, I wanted what I saw the people in the meeting having. And it wasn't so much like I wanted to be clean and sober, but I saw that they had things in their lives that I just hadn't experienced. And I saw like a life in their eyes, and they were happy to see each other, and they would hug and all this. And it was like, it was weird in one respect, but it was also like, I guess looking back now, I recognize there's really something that's authentic here that I want in my life. And I kept coming back, and I did connect my alcohol and drug use and all that. I never had to drink or use again since then. So
I remember I got sober in '88, and I remember at that time in Kansas City anyway, there was some tension in the meetings between people who identified as addicts and people who identified as alcoholics. And I mean, you would actually hear people who, got sober like in the 50s and the 60s or whatever, telling people NA is down the street and stuff like that, But what I noticed though is like that kind of subsided after a while. Maybe those old timers kind of got over it or something happened, but it just kind of stopped being an issue until a few years ago when all of a sudden groups started reading this card because they wanted to have, I don't know what they call it. Your primary purpose or whatever.
Singleness of purpose.
Singleness of purpose card.
Yeah.
So they started reading that card and they started giving people a hard time about how they identified in meetings. And the whole thing is kind of stupid because when we say my name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic or whatever, we're not even required to do that. That's just like a custom. I don't even know really what the origins of it are. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And almost anybody I know who's had problems with other drugs realizes that part of their recovery is to not drink as well. Kind of becomes a moot point.
Now most people come in with having used and abused multiple substances. And,
and we would be limiting ourselves. I mean, if the whole idea is that, we help ourselves through helping others, then we're not going to be helping ourselves very well if we're turning our backs on people that just happen to use other drugs besides alcohol. But you know what I was thinking about when you were talking about identity during your talk, is I have met over the last couple of years at our We Agnostics group, and it's usually among, people in their 20s or so, sometimes a reluctance to put a label on themselves as an alcoholic. Like, that's not really who I am. They see this as, I'm a person and I just happen to have a problem. I want to enable myself to take care of that problem. So for a while, when we had a couple of people like that in our group, I was trying my best to break the habit of saying I'm an alcoholic. And I'd say something like, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I don't know. So it was just hard for me to do because I spent so many years just saying the.
I know. I know exactly what you mean. And referring back to my talk in Tacoma, I started out by saying, "Hey, I want to do something I've never done before." Yeah. And so I introduced myself. said, "I'm Bruce. I'm a person with a substance use disorder." And it's like I do think I also would say I'm a person with a disability. I have an incomplete spinal cord injury from a skiing accident in 2001, and so I've experienced firsthand that whole thing, the whole identity around disability, as well as around alcoholism and addiction. And I really do think labels matter, and they also increasingly in our culture of, sometimes we easily just dismiss people based on a label, and that, I don't like that.
Right.
I don't like experiencing it, and I don't like seeing it when I see it happen. Probably still a lot of it just is invisible.
Yeah, and I'm learning so much now too, because of the people I meet in my home group, that identity, how a person sees himself is really important, and people have to have the freedom to kind of label themselves or identify themselves and not be put in boxes. And that encompasses everything from how we identify our gender to sexuality and I mean everything. It's really interesting, but I love being having my mind opened and understanding these things. So that's one benefit, I guess, of being around an eclectic group of people in our meetings.
Yeah.
But you mentioned too, and you talked about a little bit here about the woman you met who got sober in Minneapolis in the 80s, and you got sober in the 70s, 1975. And there's a difference. And I have heard this from others who got sober in the 70s. Joe C., for example, I think he got sober in Canada in the 70s. And he would comment that when he went to meetings, he would never see the big book anywhere, that the book that everybody liked at the time was Living Sober. John L., who got sober in the 70s in New York, would talk about how what was really what people would really focus on was the staying away from a drink one day at a time. And it wasn't so much this rigid orthodoxy of having a sponsor that goes through the steps. Did you notice any change like that? Was that your experience in the 70s? Do you see any great difference, at least from your experience, from getting sober and experiencing Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1970s as opposed to the 80s and then going forward?
I think I've seen some similar things in that, I do remember living sober being more important. I did get a copy of the big book when I was in treatment. I didn't read much of it. I guess over the years I've read, maybe most of it, but I don't think all of it.
Did you look at it and just think, wow, this is an old book?
Yeah, I did, actually. It was like the language seemed archaic back then, and some of it was just,
Yeah.
And
Living Sober was just hot off the press at the time.
Yeah. So there wasn't, that emphasis on the big book, the notion of, I got the tough sponsor, mythos of the sponsor being, coming and saying, you're going to go to 90 meetings in 90 days and we're going to work the steps, one step a week and and this and that, and, everything is regimented. We're going to do the 4-step by the big book or it's not going to work. And, I pretty much never did any of that. No. And stayed sober. I never went to 90 meetings in 90 days. I think maybe one time there was a week when I went to 6 meetings in a week. I didn't need to. Yeah. And I still stayed sober. That's the point. So,
and I think too, the whole idea about getting sober is so that you can go out into the world and do things. I actually did that. I went back to school as an adult because I always kind of regretted never finishing my education, which was interrupted by my drinking. So I went back to school. And when I was doing that, I wasn't going to very many meetings because I was busy reading and studying and meeting people. And I was okay with that because I was like, this is why I got sober. So I can do this. And then after I finished school, I was able to do some other things. But yeah.
But back to your question about AA in the 70s versus now. It's a little hard. I've moved a few times, especially I guess really in the first 10 years of my sobriety. So I lived in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and then in Duluth. And things were pretty similar. And as I described, I'd find meetings that worked and were, I was happy to be a part of and weren't overly talking about God or the big book or any of that. And then about 5 years sober, I moved to Salt Lake City and it was just night and day. Part of it was just, I was there, I'm looking around like, is there anybody here under 40 who's sober? And I was 25 at the time, and it was like, oh, not really. And I think that's really when I also started, going to meetings where How It Works was read at the beginning all the time.
Was that not happening in Minneapolis?
It was, as I recall, it was off and on, but not that often.
Wow.
I don't remember. But I get there, and it's like I'm hearing this, and to me, right out of the gate, it's, rarely have we seen a person fail. It's ableist. And, if it doesn't work for you, there's something wrong with you. Uh-huh. And I've seen, over the years, I've seen people of all stripes, all whatever, get sober and stay sober. And that includes people, who are, doing it literally, by the book, or at least by what they think the book is, and those that have nothing to do with it. And so it's really hard to predict. But back to Salt Lake City, it was really very different. And that was also where I also experienced people going to AA meetings and not drinking, but continuing to use drugs, which just I had not really seen in Minnesota because people were more aware that, okay, people would say, a drug is a drug is a drug.
Right. Isn't that interesting?
And alcohol is just another drug. And so that was interesting. I had a friend there who, I didn't know it when I first met him, but he spent about 2 years, going to meetings, but still smoking pot. And finally, one day he went to a meeting and said, well, I've quit doing all this other stuff. And it was interesting to see him actually, he was always on the margins and always in trouble and whatever and struggling, but still coming back. And finally, he quit doing that and he finally got some traction and, actually started to really, how much he worked the program, I don't remember, but he started, to live the benefits of being clean and sober.
Well, I know that science sees how these drugs affect our brains the same, whether it be alcohol or, any drug, it's
right.
doing the same thing to our brains anyway. But it's kind of a drawback from AA. If the only drug we're concerned about is alcohol, well, technically, then you're free to go do whatever you want to do.
Right.
So you started a young people's meeting in Salt Lake City, and I kind of like how you were talking about, we have to create our own community within AA. And so you were going through this period of time in Salt Lake City where you're looking around, there aren't any people like you. So you decided to create your own community. And you want to talk about that a little bit, about what it was like getting a young person's meeting going?
Yeah, well, I didn't actually start that process with trying to start a young people's meeting, but after I'd lived there maybe a year, I went back to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and that year, I think it was 1981, the ICYPA conference, International Conference of Young People in AA, was in St. Paul. And as it turned out, a friend of mine was one of the co-chairs. And so I went to this conference not really knowing what to expect and was just blown away by it, just how powerful it was to have a few thousand young people sober together in one place, celebrating that in all the ways that we celebrate. And I just remember sitting, I even have this memory of sitting in the hotel by the pool, looking around at all this and going, wow, it would be so cool to have this in Salt Lake City. It would just be, it would be amazing. And so I went back and I started going to meetings and talking about ICYPA. And people would sort of look at me like, oh, okay. Whatever. I don't know what you're really saying, but I did start meeting some other people who were young, who were, either a bit of time or some time, and were experiencing some of the same things I was. And so we started, I remember trying to start a couple young people's meetings, and there'd be 2 of us and a pot of coffee sitting there, and it took some time to get some traction. And really the thing that started taking off as a group of us got together and we decided, well, let's start our own young people's conference. And so we did that. And we started the Utah Conference of Young People in AA, which is still going on. Yeah, and then out of that, we started a ICYPA bid committee. So the first Utah conference was in 1984. And I went to the ICYPA in 1984, and I was the only person there from Utah. And in 1985, it was in Denver, and we chartered a bus and filled it full of people, and we went to Denver, and we put in a bid for ICYPA. And that was the turning point, because the people that were on that bus came back, and we were just on fire. We just had this, really powerful experience. And this was also that conference was 2 weeks before I moved up here to Seattle. And I just remember thinking, well, okay, I got this thing started, but now it's having a life of its own. And it carried on. They continued to bid for ICYPA and got the bid in 1989. And it was amazing. And now I go there, and I have a brother who lives there. Mm-hmm. I go there and get to some meetings, and they're young people sober all over the place. And now they have not just, one conference for the state, but like the cities, Salt Lake and Provo and Ogden and various areas have their own young people's groups, or, their own YPA groups. Mm-hmm. And they're getting together and they're bidding on conferences and whatever. It's really cool to see.
That's good. I think it's cool that we can do that. That we can. All we have to do is go, meet other people like ours, start hanging out together over a cup of coffee. Next thing you know, you got something going like that. You mentioned in your conversation right then and there that about your brother, and you talked about this also in your talk. That I don't know if this is the same brother who got into recovery. That
well, actually, I have two brothers, and both are in recovery. Okay. But this brother was the first one, and the one that I probably talked the most about.
Okay, and you mentioned that when he started getting sober, that it really kind of triggered for you like other memories from your experience growing up in the family. And I don't know if you're comfortable talking about it. I have a brother who was in the program for a while, and we had like two different experiences. He's not doing so great right now, but I don't know. Would you like to talk a little bit about how that impacted you, having your siblings get into the program, and are there any drawbacks and benefits to having sharing your AA experience with a family member?
Well, I guess I can't say that I really experienced many drawbacks to it. Having them in recovery, it was more the drawbacks. It's hard to have a close family member out there practicing. Yeah. And when my brother Keith was practicing, I finally came to a realization, hey, I should go to some Al-Anon meetings. And I did, and I started going regularly for some years, even a bit after he got sober. But it really helped me sort out like what's my stuff and what's not. Yeah, it was really hard to watch him go through that and really, not be able to talk about that with him. But yeah, when he did finally have something happen that his employer said, either you go to treatment now or you're fired. Mm-hmm. And he did go to a treatment center and got sober and stayed sober. I don't think today he goes to many AA meetings, but he is sober and, has found a way in the world. But it really was interesting to me. I thought they did, as part of his treatment, have a family week. So we did have some of the family from Minneapolis, and I was living in Seattle at the time, so I flew down to Salt Lake to be a part of that. And I thought, well, I think I was 12 or 13 years sober. I thought, well, I have trying to impart this wisdom or whatever. That was like, no, that just isn't how it works. And the counselor who was leading the family groups there would ask family members, are you willing to accept the gift that your family member is bringing to you? And she would ask that question, and people would think, well, the gift is that they are going to get sober, right?
Right.
That's sort of what it might go. Well, no, she was asking, this person's bringing you a gift. I mean, you are affected by alcoholism and addiction just as much as they are. And so she was asking that question, are you willing to take on some of your own work? And that question just really went right under my skin and right in. And it really was like I had this closet with stuff in it that, I had just shut the door on and sealed it up, and it was there. And that question cracked that door open, where I started to be able to see and remember things that had happened. And from my viewpoint, okay, that happened. And now what really was my part in it? And how is that affecting me today? And it was really amazing. Well, one of the things that happened when I got there, my dad and my brother were in the middle. I was a little late from the start of it, and they were in the middle of doing some work with this counselor in this group setting, and they were set up sitting in two chairs facing each other, and the counselor was on the side like a coach, shall we say, and then the people, I think there were 5 families that were there in part of this group, were watching, and they started going back to work, and it was just like I saw myself sitting in each one of those chairs. I saw the parts of myself from my dad, the parts of myself from my brother, and it was just like somebody punched me in the face or something. Wow. It was amazing. But I also came out of it still, like particularly with my father, I was incredibly angry with him, and all this started coming out. And after that, it seemed like for some months I would go to a step meeting, and it would always be on step 8. Are you willing to make amends? And I just think, I'll be goddamned if I'm going to make amends to that son of a bitch. I think that. And then I would next think, I'm carrying around this poison, but I'm still carrying it around. I don't want to let go of it. But I knew that I was going to have to find a way to let go of that. And over time, I did find a way to get through that. And it was maybe 2 or 3 years later, I remember being in Minneapolis visiting my dad, and we were sitting out on the deck of his house that overlooks the lake in suburban Minneapolis. A beautiful setting. It was a beautiful, sunny summer day. And we started talking about things that had happened with our family. My mother had died of cancer about a year before I got sober, which was a big complication. She had it for 10 years. When she first got it, she was given 3 months to live. It was a very traumatic thing for all of us. And her having the cancer, and especially her passing away when she did, after she died, I just went right off the cliff. And but we were talking about all that stuff, and we never had before. And then my dad said something. He said, I could never imagine having had a conversation like this with my father. And like almost in front of my eyes, he turned into like a 5-year-old boy. And it was like our relationship changed dramatically in that moment. And I was able to see him as just another man among men. And that was for me, like living the 9th step.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved that story when you were sharing that in Tacoma. I don't know if I actually ever had a conversation like that with my father. It's really difficult to speak with, men from that generation. And he was born in 1935. And he was an Army guy, tough. And he was just one of these people that just felt like, I don't want to talk about, the bad stuff, So I just kind of, with him, kind of changed my behavior. And I think over time, we got closer. I just tried to be there for him. But I think that conversation you had with your dad was amazing and is just what we need. I can't remember who it was, but I had a podcast with someone, and we were talking about how there's sometimes a misconception that when there's a death in the family, it brings a family together. But in reality, it really tears a family apart. And that rang true for me. I had that experience. I was 21 when my mother died, and our family just fell apart. I went off drinking. My father went off doing his thing. We all just fell apart. Yeah. And it's a very difficult, painful time. And it sounds to me like, through the process of your brother's recovery and learning, becoming aware of what was going on, that you were finally, able to have that moment of healing with your father. And that's really cool.
Yeah. And it is. I'm especially grateful for now. He's still alive. He's 89, but he's in late stage Parkinson's disease now. And so he's mentally not very present, but I do feel really fortunate to have had that, and then been able to have a relationship. I mean, there were still things that we didn't see eye to eye on and all that, but we just had a different perspective after that, for sure.
Well, you were talking also about when you reached 40 years of sobriety, you started asking yourself, why you go to AA to begin. Why you go to
Yeah.
AA. And I'm coming up on 30 years, and I kind of ask myself that sometimes too.
Yeah, right.
But you were asking yourself that, and then I think you were also around that time beginning to experience some discomfort with some of the religiosity of AA. And I was wondering if you might want to talk about that a little bit, about, what happened, what went on there, what was your answer, why do you still go to AA, and how did that whole discomfort with the religious nature of AA, how did that manifest itself?
Yeah. Well, it's been a really interesting process, because I've really experienced like a renaissance in both in my recovery in my life in general and in my relationship with AA. And yeah, I did start, I guess for years I've gone to meetings and said things like, well, the idea of a personal God has never worked for me, which is true. And I've tried to make it work in a variety of ways, and it just didn't stick. I also would say things like, I consider my spiritual experience to be about my relationship with the world, with everything in the world, people and stuff and the whole, all of it. But I did start experiencing more discomfort, and I would find groups that were, accepting of that, and the home group that I was part of at the time was pretty good. But a whole variety of experiences. But I do remember being in a meeting one time where somebody was talking about the 4-step, and they were reading some stuff out of the Big Book, and they're reading on. I'm going, oh, I forgot that was in there. That's actually pretty good. It was talking about, our stuff and our, our self-centeredness and all the stuff. I'm going, yeah, okay, I can relate to it. And then in the next paragraph, it was sort of like, and then God, and all these, capital letter words,
Right.
about, and it's like, and I'm just sitting in the meeting going, no, you just should have stopped reading right before that. And it's like, no, it doesn't follow. I mean, Bill, bless his heart, he was a salesman.
Yeah.
I think he thought of himself as a philosopher and wanted to be a philosopher, but he was a salesman. And, that's okay, because I think to get something started like what, we have here took that. But it, that didn't follow. So I was sort of like going, oh, okay, well, and when I shared that night, I just gently said, that's the first part is totally my experience. I relate to it. Mm-hmm. The second part, not so much.
Yeah.
But then I think it was not long after that meeting, there was another meeting, same group, another Sunday evening, and there was a young woman there who was, she was new to the meeting. It was one of her first AA meetings, and she introduced herself, and she said just out front, I'm an atheist, and I don't know that I don't think AA is going to work for me, but I'm here, and I've got a sponsor here. She's here with me. Her sponsor was, I should say, a secular AA person as well. But anyway, she just openly introduced herself by that, and I think she did share a bit about some of her experience there. And I shared, I guess in my way, where again I said, hey, I'm somebody who, the idea of this whole God thing and personal God and all this has never worked, and I've been sober a long time. And interestingly, there was another guy there who was also very new, who hadn't said anything, but he was an atheist too. And I got to meet him and spent some time serving as a sponsor to him. He now lives in Olympia. He's a little ways away. So I don't see him regularly anymore, but he's still sober. But it was like, yeah, okay, this, there's something missing to me, and I would like to find more like-minded people. And somewhere in there, I also started listening to your podcast, and I remember listening to you and Ben doing the steps, and those are those were just great podcasts, that whole series. But there were just a whole bunch of them that I really enjoyed. And one of them, you interviewed Willow, who's here in Seattle. And I was going, oh, well, that's kind of cool. She got sober when she was 15. Okay, she's young. I can relate to that. And then she talked about moving to Seattle, and sort of my ears picked up. And she talked about a meeting or a couple of meetings in the Seattle area here that were relatively new that I hadn't heard of, called Many Paths meetings. And so it's like, well, I got to go to these meetings. So I did. And it was really like a breath of fresh air. I mean, to go to a meeting, the first one I went to, I remember just sitting there and I'm going, okay, well, they didn't read how it works.
Yeah.
That's great. It was just like a checklist. I sort of went through this mental checklist of things I would want to have in a meeting and not want to have. And it was like, it hit most of the boxes. I'm going, this is really nice. So I started attending that meeting regularly and had the idea, well, those meetings are a little south of Seattle. And I thought, well, we need one of these right in the middle of Seattle. So about a year ago, I started a meeting, also called Many Paths. And we meet at 5 o'clock on Sundays now in a place called the Recovery Cafe, which is just right on the edge of downtown Seattle.
Oh, neat. And how's that meeting going?
Well, it's going okay. We actually, when we first started it, we were in a neighborhood called Capitol Hill, which is pretty vibrant. A lot of younger people there, but people of like all ages and all stripes, all sorts of gender identities and every kind of mix of stuff. It's a very interesting place. So started that in a coffee shop, and it was kind of important to me to not be in a church. I know some people, that's an easy place. Churches are welcoming, usually, and the rent's usually reasonable and all that, so they're good places, but I wanted to just kind of not have that. So I found this coffee shop with a meeting room, and we basically outgrew that space. Wow. And so we moved to the Recovery Cafe at the beginning of the year, and moving a meeting is hard.
Yeah.
And so it's now starting to build back up, but it's a good little meeting. And there are people that come there that just say, I just like the feel. And I started also to be really openly open. I really don't care what you believe or don't believe. Yeah. Because I think I don't want to do to other people what some people in AA do to me. To say, you have to. Yeah, it is. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, as you said.
I really liked how you did in Seattle what you did in Salt Lake City. When you weren't real comfortable with what was going on with your AA world, you just kind of created your own community, Yeah. And that's a really neat experience to have. I got to experience that here in Kansas City when I helped start our We Agnostics group. And all of a sudden, my whole AA world shifts from my big book loving thumping book group to this other totally free experience. And it's just really nice to be able to have the ability to do that.
Well, I think it's one of the things, we think about, well, what can we do and how? And the fourth tradition really is, gives us this freedom to do that. I mean, I've even thought, well, I should start another meeting now called, I hate AA or something like that, Yeah, and there's that quote of the bill says, you can get if you get a few people together, and even if you're, anti everything, including anti AA, you can still call yourself an AA group.
That's right, absolutely. I think that's hilarious, but it's true, and it's neat that we can do that. Speaking about AA and traditions and stuff like that, one final thing I wanted to talk about. You were mentioning the importance of how we carry our message, how we communicate the message. And you were kind of talking about, when you go to the AA.org website on your cell phone, it's not really a great user experience.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. What are we doing wrong? What can we do differently? What should we do doing?
Well, Yeah, I think of like back in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan coined this term that the medium is the message. And I really think what he was saying is that the way you present something is just as important, if not more important, as what you're presenting. And I decided to go to AA.org on my iPhone a little while ago, and it was not a great experience. It's hard to navigate. It's kind of set up. It does present itself differently on a mobile device than it does on a computer, but most of the content is still in PDF format. You know, it's built for print publication only. So if you want to know more about things about AA, you end up having to look at PDF files, and they first have to download onto the device, and then some of them are formatted better than others, and it wasn't that good an experience. And one of the particular ones that was weird was that they have things about problems other than alcohol, and it has this little caveat that, well, Bill wrote this in 1958, and we think it's just as pertinent today as it was then. And when I see that, it's like, okay, that was 60 years ago. Okay. And go in there and it's, read this PDF. And actually they did, when I first looked at it, the way the PDF was formatted, it was all jumbled. It was formatted to be printed on a paper and then, bound into a booklet. So the page orders would be right. So the page ordering was just all wrong. They did at least fix that recently, but still it's this pamphlet. And most of it, what it talks about is like, who's a member? Who can be a member? And, I think if I'm coming to AA and I have problems with alcohol, I guess probably because that's why I'm there, but I have problems with other stuff as well. That's probably not going to speak to me very well if I make it through and get to the PDF file.
Right.
When it's saying, all right, what does it mean to be? I don't care about being a member, and I think just in general, our society, the idea of being a member of something, back 60 years ago or whatever, that was more important than it is today. Things are more fluid and boundaries are more fluid. But just in terms of literature, both the AA website and the Grapevine website isn't great either.
No, you're right.
And,
I agree.
And there's the Grapevine has some more flexibility. Before I talk about that, I think one of the issues that AA has, it's sort of like this albatross around our neck now, is conference approved literature. And we have this archaic, bizarre process for going through all of this. And like a while ago, maybe 9 months ago, I went to our local intergroup to get some pamphlets for the meeting I started. So I thought, well, I should have some pamphlets around. And so I just went in and I grabbed a selection of things, that included, various things, young people, women, other, just a selection of maybe half a dozen pamphlets. And I get home and I show them to my wife, and she picks up AA for the Woman and starts reading it. And it was written over 30 years ago and hadn't been updated. Now I think they are updating that one, or they have just recently updated that one. But of these pamphlets I picked, at the time the newest one was AA for young people, and it was 10 years old. That's. The iPhone came out in 2007, so just over 10 years ago. So, when that has really changed the way we relate to stuff, to information, and maybe I'm repeating myself here, but but conference approved literature, it's very difficult to get something new, and it takes years to go through the process. And I know there are some people talking about this idea of bringing this Godward pamphlet from Britain over here, which
they approve.
I don't know, it's better, but it's still, the pamphlet's got a weird name.
Oh, the Godward. Mm-hmm.
The Godward. It's like, if I'm somebody, who's looking at AA and I don't believe it. I'm not going to know what that means.
Right.
Um, and I've
really read pamphlets anyway.
Yeah, people don't read pamphlets. You know, they need it to be, a interactive Facebook thing or something like that.
Well, we've been really bad. And I say AA, but we're just really slow with technology. I mean, it frustrates me that the Grapevine site is so bad, really. And I hate to say that because I love the people that work at the Grapevine. But
yeah, well, I think in some ways they have the freedom to print.
Yeah,
stuff
they can. They do, and they do. And they have more updated stuff. Yeah.
Like the Atheist was October 2016. The Atheist one they had. That was great. I picked that up and I read through it.
It was a good issue.
Yeah, it was a great issue.
And they're going to publish a whole book about atheist stories this year. So yeah, they can do stuff like that. But their website design is a mess. It's better on the mobile phone actually than on a desktop, but still, it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah. I still would. I was just looking at it the other day and had a few things. Yeah, I'd bring up an article and it wouldn't be laid out quite right on my screen, so I'd have to mess around with it to get it so that I didn't have to scroll sideways and things. Yeah, things like that. But those things do speak louder than you might think.
Yeah. I think we should have more free content too. And I was telling her
that was my thing too. It's like everything's behind a paywall. So if I'm, I understand there's this problem of how is it supported,
right?
But
they are supported through their subscriptions, and that's their mandate. They can't take like donations or anything. It has to be self-supporting through subscriptions. But their website, they should be using the website, in my opinion. And I'm not a guy who's in marketing or anything, but I think the website should be drawing people into wanting to subscribe. And you need to give them some free content, more free content, and more interaction. With make it more of a community on that site, so that people would want to get more involved with it, because it is right now it's not really accessible for anyone.
Yeah, it's really still the print publication model is behind, and it's.
But they're pretty forward thinking. Yeah. The executive editor, publisher, she actually went to the General Service Conference a few years ago, and she was asking them to use their imagination. And she said, imagine if we had our own YouTube channel. Imagine if we had a podcast, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But I don't know if they will.
Well, I hope. I think looking at things in the history of AA, sometimes there have been times where things have changed more rapidly. Maybe we'll get to a point where people start thinking, "Oh, we can do a lot better, and we can reach more people." And it does concern me. There are attendance statistics which are really difficult to compile in an organization that's anonymous. But I remember early in sobriety, it seemed like in my sobriety, that the size of AA was like doubling every 5 years or something. And then somewhere in the mid-90s, it just kind of stopped. It got up to 2 to 2.5 million, and that's where we're sitting. And now we're maybe seeing some decline, though I don't know that it's, given the way the data is collected, it may not be statistically significant, but that growth that used to happen is not happening. And there are lots of alternatives, and people have access to that information in ways that they just never had. I don't know the answer, but I hope we can keep talking more and more about the questions.
Yeah, I do too. And another nice thing about it, though, is that, we can have our AA Beyond Belief, we can have AA Agnostica, stuff like that. And, the Grapevine knows about AA Beyond Belief, and they're fine with what we do. And so we can do our own thing too. But I don't know. I might interact with that Grapevine a little bit more and see if I can give them some ideas.
Yeah.
But like I say, I'm no expert either, but gosh darn. Anyway. So thank you. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you. I love doing these podcasts. It's just like having a chat with a friend.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed our time together here too. And
I love Minneapolis, by the way. What a great city.
Yeah. It is fun. I've been, because my father's health isn't so good, I've been traveling there frequently, and it's nice.
Yeah, my wife and I went up there for a vacation once.
Yeah.
In the Midwest, you go to these fun places, Omaha,
Right.
Minneapolis.
Yeah. It's
Anyway.
it's a good city, and I guess the part I don't miss is the climate, but there's a lot that I do miss. So.
Well, again, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And that concludes another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. Thank you for listening, everybody.